This is the Tudors Dynasty Podcast. And now, Rebecca Larson.
On today's episode, I welcome another one of my favorite historians and authors, Leanda de Lisle. Leanda and I talk about the Tudors, James I, and his son, Charles I. You just never know where these topics will lead, and I had an absolute blast discussing them with Leanda. I'm Rebecca Larson, host of the Tudors Dynasty Podcast and owner of TudorsDynasty.com. Telling the stories of those who lived centuries before us is what I enjoy doing most. Whether it be a show on one subject or an interview with an author or historian, I'll bring you the tales of 16th century England. Before I get started today, I need to take a minute to thank all the folks who became patrons since my last episode. Stephanie W., Alexandra O., Tiffany B., Brianna S., Avery, and Kathy D., as well as a shout out to Kelly R. for increasing her pledge, and a thank you to all of my existing patrons as well. A full list of patrons can be found at TudorsDynastyPodcast.com. If you'd like to become a patron, you can do so by going to Patreon, that's patreon.com/TudorsDynasty, and click Become a Patron. For as little as $1 per month, you can show your support. Without further ado, Leanda de Lisle. Welcome to the show.
Hello.
I have followed you for quite a few years now, but for those who are listening who may be unfamiliar with your work, maybe you could give them just a brief bio.
Right. Well, I read history at university, at Oxford University. I then went into journalism for a number of years. I was a columnist for all sorts of different newspapers and magazines. And then for the last 20 years, really, I returned to history, and I have been writing books about the Tudors and the Stuarts.
And you do a little TV as well, right?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yes, I do television. I have a podcast. I do radio, all sorts of things. Yes. So, and in fact, there's a new BBC series which they're just making at the moment about the execution of Charles I. And I think I'm being filmed for that on October the 23rd or whatever. So yes, there's always something going on.
I was just going to say, you're quite busy.
Yeah, no, definitely quite busy. I saw on Twitter someone saying that they were a writer, they're looking forward to the weekend. And I was thinking, really? I wasn't aware writers had weekends.
You're just constantly working and researching and preparing, and it's quite the life, but I bet it's a lot of fun.
Yes, no, absolutely. Like all work, it has its ups and downs, but on the whole, it's a good life.
Well, speaking of ups and downs, usually when I have guests on the show, I ask them this question, and it's one that's probably plagued centuries. Who is your favorite consort of Henry VIII and why?
My favorite consort of Henry VIII is Catherine of Aragon. And I like Catherine of Aragon because she was the only wife of whom he was really afraid. She was tough. I mean, her mother, Isabel of Castile, was, the great warrior queen. And she was very much her mother's daughter. And he once said he was very concerned that he would lead armies. She would lead armies against him. And indeed, in fact, she did. She had been put in charge of his armies when he was in France. And she was facing the King of Scots, James IV of Scots, at Flodden, where James IV was killed. And she then wanted to send James's head to Henry in France. But the English thought this was rather bad taste and asked her not to. And so she just sent his sort of bloodied clothes, which arrived duly in France. And Henry sort of opened the package and saw his fellow king's clothes all covered in blood and gore and torn, and was slightly shocked by it, actually. A little foretaste of what his wife might do to him.
I love that. And I've read in places before where he may have been a little bit jealous of her victory over his in France at the time. And I always wonder if that was really the case.
Well, I'm sure he was obviously pleased, but yes, I mean, I think that he would have. Yeah, I'm sure he would have liked that. He would have liked that glory. Yes, I think, was he ever jealous of Catherine? I'm not sure if he was jealous of her exactly. He was certainly quite intimidated by her at times.
And another queen, so to speak, Lady Jane Grey, you wrote this book called The Sisters Who Would Be Queen about the Grey sisters, which, by the way, was, I think, my first introduction to your writing. And it's one of my all-time favorite Tudor books.
Thank you.
It's nonfiction, but it really reads as fiction. And that's what I loved, because it was easy. Sometimes nonfiction books can be kind of dull and hard to read, but you really made the story of the Grey sisters quite interesting. What inspired you to write that book?
Well, the first book I wrote was on the death of Elizabeth and the accession of King James. And most people believe that, the last of the Tudors, Elizabeth I dies, and then King James is her heir. And we've all been told that, Mary, Queen of Scots, used to be her heir, who was James's mother. And, that's why she had her head chopped off. And in fact, I discovered while I was researching this book that, in fact, under English law, Elizabeth's heir was not Mary, Queen of Scots, or indeed King James, but these younger Grey sisters, Lady Catherine and Lady Mary Grey, who were the young sisters of the famous 9 Days Queen, Lady Jane Grey. And I thought, well, that's a fascinating story. And so I looked up I began to research their lives. And indeed, they had the most extraordinary and interesting lives. And I didn't think at the time there'd be anything new to say about Jane, because I thought she was well known. But as I started researching their lives, I discovered that in fact, there were lots of new things to say about Jane, and lots that had been written about Jane was untrue. And so I wrote a book in the end about all three sisters, Jane, Catherine, and Mary Grey.
And one of the questions I think that comes up a lot in the Tudor world on social media is, why did Edward VI skip over Lady Jane Grey's mother, Frances Brandon, and his device for succession?
Well, I think that's a very good question. And he did ask Frances to come and see him while he was on his deathbed. We don't know what was said, but he presumably gave her some good reasons for doing this. I think, first of all, it's worth bearing in mind that Francis was under Henry VIII's will, the long stop heir to Elizabeth was to Henry's daughter Elizabeth Tudor was Lady Jane Grey. It was never Francis. Francis was overlooked under Henry's will, and I think there are various reasons for this. I think actually the principal reason is that Henry wanted only very weak heirs to Edward. He didn't want Edward's reign threatened in any way. He was aware that Edward was going to inherit when he was only a child, that Henry would not live long enough for Edward to reach adulthood. And you have to remember that Henry VIII's uncles were the princes in the Tower, the little boys who disappeared in the time of Richard III. And he did not want the same fate for his son. So he wanted to make sure that Edward didn't have any adult heirs. Frances was an adult. She was married to an adult man, but therefore a threat. So he overlooked her and went straight to this little girl, Jane, who was the same age as Edward, approximately the same age as Edward. Then when Edward decides to write his will, I think he follows his father's will, which excludes Frances. But also, he didn't really believe in female rule. He wanted a male heir, and Frances hadn't had any children for a number of years and was very unlikely at this stage in her life to produce a son. Whereas Jane was young, just been married to Guildford Dudley, the son of his Lord President, and was much more likely to produce a son.
And then her sister Catherine, of course, had a couple sons, and she had the most tragic love story of all, if you ask me. It's very similar, I think, to her cousin, Queen Elizabeth. To me, is a tragic love story with Elizabeth and Robert Dudley. But do you think Robert Dudley actually loved her as a woman, or did he only love her as a queen? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it is absolutely impossible to know. I think he may well have loved her, but so difficult to separate love from ambition at that time under those circumstances. There's a saying by a Greek philosopher called Demosthenes, and he says that there's nothing easier than self-deceit, because what a man wants to believe, he believes to be true. What is convenient for him to believe, he believes to be true. So Robert Dudley may have believed himself to be in love with Elizabeth because it was convenient for him to be in love with Elizabeth. I mean, he may not even have known himself what his true feelings were. So I don't think one can know. But I don't think it was completely cynical. I think Elizabeth was too intelligent, and they were very sort of natural together. When you read about them, they seem very natural together. The way she'd stroke his neck and they would joke together. And he knew her very well. And of course, their relationship also went on for a very, very long time. And I don't think you could keep that up for that length of time if there wasn't a genuine connection.
Right, because they had known each other since they were children, right?
Yes, they had known each other since they were children, but of course, they'd had a sort of relationship since, from the 1550s until his death in the 1580s. That's a long time.
It is. And I wonder if maybe Robert was one of the people that she trusted because of that, which made their relationship even stronger.
Yes, I think that's right. I think she did. I think she was cross with him sometimes. There were certainly times when he did things that she didn't agree with or approve of, but she trusted him as much as she trusted anyone. She trusted him to the extent that she didn't think that he would sort of plot her downfall. But I don't think she would have trusted him completely, because he certainly did things behind her back that she didn't approve of,
like marry her cousin.
Well, that was very bad. Yes, no, absolutely, he did that. But also, I think he may have encouraged Darnley to go to Scotland, which in the 1560s. So he did political things as well that she wouldn't have approved of. But yeah, no, marrying her cousin. Oh my God, no, that was very bad. But poor Robert Dudley, he was desperate for an heir. He was desperate to have a son to carry on his line.
And you can't blame him for that at all. I mean, that was the name of the game back then.
Exactly, absolutely, it really was the name of the game back then. So yes, it was a way he had actually stayed unmarried for as long as he did was in itself a great sacrifice, a genuine sacrifice, particularly after it became clear that she wasn't going to marry him.
And speaking of sons, so we jump forward in time to your most recent book, The White King, about Charles I, who was one of the sons of King James I of England. So what inspired you to jump into Charles I's reign?
Well, one of my favorite books when I was a child were books by this historian called C.V. Wedgwood about Charles I. It was just tremendously exciting. His reign's very, very exciting, full of interesting people and characters. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, when I did a book on the death of Elizabeth, I was looking forward to what came next. And much of the drama of the Tudor era finds its resolution during the reign of Charles I. And so it kind of ties up the loose end, it ties up the story. Many of the leading figures of Elizabeth's reign still appear. Their children are very much important figures during Charles's reign. And I think one of the reasons that, and I also felt there was a great opportunity to introduce people to the women of that era, because it's been, people have written about Charles, they just write about, sort of warty Cromwellian Puritans and sort of flouncing men in lace-top boots. And you don't really hear much about Charles's remarkable queen, who's been much maligned, who was an incredible figure, who also sort of led armies during the Civil War, and the amazing kind of female spies who were involved, and all sorts of incredible characters, which I thought people would enjoy discovering. And actually, it's all very relevant now as well. I mean, in England, it's got a lot of modern relevance because we've got all these tremendous arguments going on in Parliament around Brexit and so forth, and I think people are also interested in seeing some of the parliamentary drama of Charles's reign.
And sometimes I feel like in modern day now, the Tudor era gets the most attention because of all the drama. But I love that we have historians like yourself who are looking at these other time periods and showing us that it's just as interesting. There was just as much drama going on during this time as well.
Oh my God, there was, absolutely. There was absolutely. I mean, it's an incredibly exciting and a dramatic story. And as I said, it is like the sort of the culmination of the Tudor drama. I mean, the symbol on the front of my book is taken from a diplomatic passport of the time, and it entwines, the thistle of Scotland, the Stuarts, and the Tudor rose, and that's what it is. It's the story. It's the Tudor story meets the Stuart story. It's when England becomes Britain, and of course you have the beginning of the colonies of what later becomes the United States.
I love it. And just very much like Henry VIII being the second son, Charles was the second son. What happened to his brother? Tell us a little bit about his brother.
Yes, absolutely. You're absolutely right to pick up on the fact that Henry VIII also had an elder brother, because sometimes people say, oh yeah, Charles, he was never ready to be king because he had an elder brother, which is complete nonsense. It's no truer than it was of Henry VIII, who also had an elder brother who died. His elder brother, Charles' elder brother, was called Henry, in fact, indeed, after Henry VIII. And he died of TB when he was 18. Charles was 11 and, was with him at his deathbed, holding his hand while doctors were trying to cure him by tying dead pigeons to his head, which you'll be unsurprised to learn wasn't very successful.
I can't imagine why that didn't work.
Oh, I know. Can you imagine not only to sort of die horribly of TB, but to die also looking ridiculous with a pigeon tied to your head?
Oh my goodness. So, but Charles himself had some health issues when he was a child too, right?
Yes, he did. And there's a lot of untruths written about it. I think he may have had tongue tie, which sort of stops you from, being able to suckle easily. So he was small as a baby and had weak legs. And his sort of lingual deformity meant he had a sort of mild stutter. But he was extremely determined, and he trained himself through sort of running and walking and riding to become an extremely fit and athletic young man who was an expert horseman who walked so fast that his courtiers would sort of run to keep up with him. He was very, very energetic. He had a stutter, but it was quite a mild stutter. His exact contemporary, Louis XIII of France, had a really appalling stutter, which nobody ever hears about, but he did. But Charles taught himself with singing lessons, the help of singing lessons, to be able to speak clearly. Although he didn't like giving long, garrulous speeches like his father had, I think much to everyone's great relief. So I think that often it's used against him. It was like he's sort of physically weak. He must be a weak king, a weak man. We use this kind of shorthand still in a rather shocking way of physical disability being a kind of mark of human weakness. So if you saw a film like Wonder Woman, you would notice that Wonder Woman is a very beautiful, perfect physical specimen, while her enemy, Dr. Poison, is scarred. And this comes from some very ancient sort of beliefs in disability and disfigurement being reflections of sin. And it is weird that we still use this same shorthand, and really quite shocking. It's no more true than if you or I had a scar on our face that would make us a bad person. It's no more true that because Charles had weak legs as a child, that it made him a weak man.
What kind of relationship did he have with his father?
Yes, that's very interesting again, because he got on very well with his mother. Unlike James, Charles liked women and got on well with women. And he enjoyed joking with it and having a good time with his mother. He was quite, I think, intimidated by his father. His father, King James, was a very remarkable man, very highly educated, brilliant intellectual, and had been a king of Scotland, which is a very violent country, since he was a baby. So he was a very sort of confident king. And I think it could be quite intimidating. Charles looked up to his father and didn't approve of everything his father did. I mean, when Charles became king, he changed things. I mean, James drank like a fish and was quite, was a bit of a drunk. So Charles sort of tidied up the court. He didn't approve of, heavy drinking and general sort of bad behavior and corruption. But he did very much look up to his father's writings, and his father was a great expert on theology, taught Charles that the Church of England was the best in the world, which Charles firmly believed, encouraged Charles's belief in divine right kingship, which was a concept that James had developed. He looked up to his father.
When Queen Elizabeth died and James came to England, he left Charles behind in Scotland, didn't he, for a while?
Yes, Charles was only a baby and was, as I said, a sickly baby. And so he stayed behind for a year before he followed his parents and siblings south. And his father, in fact, I remember, sent up doctors, highly paid doctors to sort of bring him down. I mean, it was perfectly possible that Charles would, die, as small children often did. But, he proved resilient.
I often wonder, too, because they had a sister, Elizabeth, correct?
Yes, he did. Absolutely. The Winter Queen of Bohemia, who married when she was 16 and went off to Germany.
It makes me wonder if, Henry died at 18, Charles was sickly. If both of them had died, it really makes me wonder what kind of Queen Elizabeth would have been.
Yes, no, absolutely. If indeed she had become queen, would she have been accepted? Possibly she would have been, but there was still, Catherine Grey's heirs were still very much alive and kicking and around. So it was not impossible that Elizabeth was, on the other side of the channel with her husband. It was not impossible that there might have been a fight for the throne. Elizabeth might not just have been accepted. She might not have become queen at all. I mean, it may have been William Seymour, Earl of Hertford, instead.
That's a great point. I didn't even think of that. It could have been the Seymours on the throne. I love that idea too.
Absolutely. It could very easily have been. I mean, they were still ambitious. In 1625, even before that, I think 1624, which is a year before Charles became king, they were they were looking to make sure that they could prove that Catherine Grey's marriage was to Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, in the 16th century was valid, and that therefore they were legitimate and had a rightful claim to the throne. They were doing that in 1624, 1625, even when Charles was king. William Seymour was building this incredible tomb at Salisbury Cathedral, with the monuments to his grandmother, Lady Catherine Grey, and her husband. Again, sort of a reminder of who they were. That she was a royal princess. Oh yeah, they were still definitely ambitious at the time.
Seems like there's always plots, behind all the scenes. No matter who the monarch was, there's always a plot to put somebody else on the throne.
Absolutely, and of course, so again, the Seymour name. This goes back to the reign of Edward VI, you were talking about earlier. I mean, this guy is descended from the Protector Somerset, Edward uncle who ruled, England after the death of Henry VIII. That's what I mean about actually Charles's life. It isn't Elizabeth's death doesn't really end the Tudor story. These people are still around, and the drama really does continue. I was thinking to find some kind of resolution really when Charles's head is cut off at the end of the Civil War.
The drama. I really feel like that's what intrigues the people who end up finding a passion for English royal history in general, is the drama that is surrounded by the throne. It's like a modern day soap opera. What we call a soap opera in the US is you just never know what's going to happen, who's scheming behind the scenes, and who's going to come out ahead. And that's what makes it so fun to learn about.
Yes, and I think what's exactly, and these are human beings. I think that's the important thing as a writer, not to lose sight of. These are all people. They're human beings who have feelings like we do, but they're ordinary human beings like the rest of us, placed in extraordinary circumstances, and that's always fascinating.
What do you wish everyone knew about Charles I?
I would wish that everyone knew about Charles I. I would say that he was a man of great courage and principle, which I think would surprise a lot of people. That he was a good man, although not a good king.
Interesting. Well, I want everybody to go out and buy your book, of course, so that they can learn more about him. But before we get to that and the details on how to get the book, I want to pose the fun question that I ask all of my guests, and I'd love to hear your answer. If I were to give you a time machine, what time in history would you visit?
Gosh, well, that's a very interesting question. It's difficult, isn't it? Because I hope I wouldn't be there too long. Because if you go back very far, there are no antibiotics for starters. But I would be fascinated to go back to the 1520s. So during the reign of Henry VIII, before the Reformation, just before the Reformation, before the destruction began. Because after that, after the 1530s, between the 1530s and the 1640s, over 90% of English religious art in particular, was destroyed. 90%, and also just as much music. Music will never know what it sounded like because so many original manuscripts were destroyed after the Reformation. So I'd love to go back and see the art that we lost, because we just don't know what most English art looked like, and we don't know what music was written, and to hear that music and see that art, I think that would be fascinating.
The music that remains from that time period that I hear is so soothing and relaxing to me. It's one of the things, like when I'm doing research, I like to just put on a pair of headphones and listen to lute music, because I think there's something so beautiful about it.
Yes, no, absolutely. There is some lovely surviving music from this period. It's sort of mind-boggling to think what might have been lost. Can you imagine if sort of all Mozart's music was sort of destroyed and we'd never heard it?
Yeah, that would be insane.
How many Mozarts might have, we'll never know, lived and died and had wonderful music that people heard that we will never hear because the manuscripts were all destroyed.
I've never thought of it that way before. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. A fellow Tudor page on Facebook, it's called the Tudor Prince, posed a question this week that I absolutely loved, and I had to share with my followers as well, that I want to ask you. So if you were to host a dinner party during the Tudor era, what 4 people would you invite to it and why?
Gosh, if I was, 4 Tudor people coming to dinner, it'd be quite tempting to have Henry VIII and 3 of his wives, wouldn't it? That would make some wonderful blood-curdling scenes. That could be. I don't know. I think that could be quite fun. And maybe we could get all the wives to turn on Henry VIII. We could have Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, and who should we have as was the. I think it would have to be. Catherine Parr, poor old Catherine Howard. No, I think I'd have Catherine Parr. I think that could be quite fun. They could all tell him a few things, tell him a few home truths.
I'm seeing like a talk show play out with the three wives and Henry and food being thrown and words flying.
It has to be three wives. It had to be three wives. So, gosh, which three would one choose? Catherine and Anne, gosh, they would quarrel to the death. Catherine Anne and Catherine, yeah, I think Catherine Aragon, Catherine Parr, and Anne Boleyn would be the three wives I would choose, because I think they'd be the best at standing up for themselves with Henry.
I think so too. Anne of Cleves, as much as I adore her, I feel like she wouldn't add much to the party.
No, she was very interesting, and I'm it's so good that more interest is now focused on Anne of Cleves, who of course lived the longest, lived right into the reign of Mary Tudor. Had a magnificent funeral during the reign of Mary Tudor. Yes, no, I suspect she might, although you just don't know. Of course, maybe now that they're all dead and the one will be reborn, who knows? An entirely different side of her character might come out.
That's quite possible. I just recently read Heather R. Darcy's book on a Duchess of Cleves, and it's a fascinating take on her life from the German perspective, and it is an eye opener against everything that we've ever learned about Anne of Cleves, and some new findings with records. And I think it's really helped the resurgence of Anne of Cleves' popularity. And I love to see it, because I feel like Anne Boleyn has had center stage for so long that it's nice to see another wife take that stage.
Yes, no, I agree. And also there's been this ridiculous slander endlessly repeated that she was ugly and a sort of Flanders mare, when nothing, which is just a sort of quote invented by a Victorian writer called Agnes Strickland. At the time, she was considered just as attractive as Catherine Howard, but just not by Henry, which is a different matter. And then it's sort of interesting to see why Henry perceived her particularly in the way he did, rather than that. Do you remember that drama? Was it called Tudor or Tudors? Do you remember the Tudors? Do you remember the Tudors?
Yes.
I loved watching it. I watched that with one of my sons. It was such fun. But anyway, one of the things I really enjoyed about the Tudors was it had a really beautiful Anne of Cleves. I don't know if you remember, but she was lovely. And I thought, yes, good for you. Good. You've got a beautiful Anne of Cleves.
Yeah, she was a famous singer too. And for some reason, her name is escaping my mind, the actress who played her.
Very beautiful woman, I remember.
She was. It was very nice to be able to see that played out in a different way. So something else that people may not know about you, or I hope they do, is that you have a podcast as well called 10-Minute Tudors.
Yes, that's right. And I bring it out monthly, and it's quite short. So I say 10 minutes. I don't know. I don't do it exactly. So sometimes it's 8 minutes and sometimes it's 12 minutes or whatever. Don't set but your watch by it is all I would say. And what I do is I sort of look at different myths or unusual stories that people may not know. So in one, for example, I discuss why Anne Boleyn had her head chopped off with a sword, not with an axe. And it's not the reason which is usually given. It's not because she was brought up in France. And this month, I'm doing the story of the Essex ring. I don't know if you can hear this dog snoring in the background. I do hope not. But anyway, I apologize to your listeners if you can hear a dog snoring in the background. I have a very small dog beside me snoring rather loudly. Anyway, about the story of the Essex ring, which is this ring that Elizabeth I is supposed to have given her last favourite, the Earl of Essex. And he betrays her at the end of her life and tries to raise the court against her. It's said that he tries to send her this ring after he's captured and put in the tower and is due to be executed, to ask for mercy. But somebody steals the ring, and so she never gets it, and so he is executed. And then her cousin, when her cousin is dying, which is actually not long before Elizabeth herself dies, she says that she had taken this ring, and she apologizes to Elizabeth. And Elizabeth supposedly shakes this woman in her bed and says, God may forgive you, but I never can. Anyway, the interesting thing is this ring actually exists and is currently in the museum in Westminster Abbey. But I tell in this month's podcast the true story of the ring, which is actually more interesting than the legend. So people might enjoy that. It's only 10 minutes.
I love your podcast. I'm a subscriber and I love when new episodes come out, and I implore everyone to subscribe to it. I follow it on Apple Podcasts, but I'm sure it can be found in other places as well.
Thank you. It's on SoundCloud. I don't know what else it's on.
What else? You have so many other things going on. You have books, and of course you have a Facebook page, and you have Twitter and all of that. How can everybody find you and your work?
I have a website, leandadelile.com. I know my name is a nightmare and impossible to spell. It's LeandaDelisle. So I have a website which has all my books and also my podcast, and I think links to some YouTube films. There's a YouTube lecture on Jane Grey called England's Forgotten Queen, and there's another one on Charles called Downfall, and it's got some links to all those things as well, I think.
Wonderful, and I will include the links to everything so that people can find your work too.
Thank you very much.
Yes, and thank you, Leanda, so much for being on the show today. It was a great pleasure speaking with you.
Yeah, that's quite all right. I very much enjoyed it.
And that concludes this episode of the Tudors Dynasty Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. You can find my show notes from this episode and how to become a patron at tudorsdynastypodcast.com. Don't want to miss an episode? Be sure to subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Patreon, Podbean, or anywhere you can find podcasts. Intro and outro music called Folk Round by Kevin MacLeod, Incompetech.com. Creative Commons license via filmmusic.io.
Thanks for checking out the Tudors Dynasty Podcast. Read more on the blog at tudorsdynasty.com. Follow Tudors Dynasty on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Subscribe to Tudors Dynasty on iTunes. Thanks for listening.